The air in the town of Marlow always carried the scent of rain, even when the skies remained clear. It was a place where the mundane world slipped quietly into the background, and the mysterious lingered in the shadows. Amidst the cobbled streets and ivy-clad buildings, there stood a peculiar library, the one place everyone in town spoke of but rarely visited. The Library of Vanishing Books, its name whispered in reverence and fear. Ellis Gray had always been a man of reason. He sought answers, never indulging in superstition or mystery. Yet, as fate would have it, he found himself standing before the grand oak doors of the library one chilly autumn afternoon. The books had always intrigued him. Not the ones lining the shelves of his own study or the local bookstore, but the ones that seemed to slip through the cracks of time, forgotten, never seen by the light of day. Ellis had heard rumors, stories of books that vanished after being read, tales of knowledge that faded as soon as it was understood. Most dismissed them as nothing more than fanciful tales spun by the elderly to frighten children. But Ellis wasn't a fool. He knew there was something more, something real buried beneath the fabric of the town's stories. The door creaked as Ellis pushed it open, a gust of cold air rushing past him as though the library itself exhaled. Inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of old paper and dust, and the shelves stretched high into darkness. He took a cautious step forward, his footsteps muffled by the thick, worn carpet. The silence was profound, oppressive almost, as if the library itself were holding its breath. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, emerged from the shadowed depths of the library. Her eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost translucent, studied Ellis with an unsettling intensity. She was tall, unnaturally so, and her movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step took an immense effort. "You've come," she said, her voice soft but clear, as though she had been expecting him. There was no greeting, no pleasantry, just an acknowledgement. Ellis cleared his throat, unsure of how to proceed. "I've heard of this place. I was curious about the books. The ones that vanish." The librarian's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "The books that vanish, they are not for everyone, you know. You must be careful with your desires, Mr. Gray. Curiosity is a double-edged sword." Ellis stiffened. "I'm not afraid of what I'll find. I want to know what happens to them. The books. Why do they disappear?" "Perhaps," the librarian said, her voice almost a whisper now, "you should first ask yourself why you want to know." Before Ellis could respond, she turned and walked deeper into the library, her long shadow stretching ahead of her. Hesitant but determined, Ellis followed, feeling the weight of the library closing in around him. The shelves seemed to shift, the titles blurring in his vision, as though the very space was alive, constantly changing, adapting. He could hear the soft rustle of pages turning, the faint murmur of voices that seemed to come from nowhere, or perhaps from everywhere. Ellis's heart raced as he stepped further into the labyrinth of shelves. The air grew colder, and the silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, as though the library itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a choice. Then, ahead of him, a book on the shelf caught his eye. It was bound in black leather, its title embossed in gold but so faded he could barely read it. The pages within seemed to shimmer faintly, as if beckoning him closer. With trembling hands, Ellis reached for it. As his fingers brushed the cover, the lights in the library flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. He yanked his hand back as though burned, but the book remained on the shelf, its pages whispering. "Take it," the librarian's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the darkness, and Ellis, heart pounding, found himself unable to resist. Ellis hesitated for only a moment before his hand returned to the book, drawn as if by some invisible force. His fingers, still trembling from the sudden chill, wrapped around the faded leather. The book felt heavier than it appeared, its presence unnerving. A soft whisper brushed against his ear, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface, but when he turned to look, there was nothing but the shadows. The moment his hand made contact with the book's spine, the air shifted. It wasn't just the coldness, nor the silence that had taken over the library. It was as though the very essence of the room had stilled, holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Ellis glanced over his shoulder, but the librarian had vanished from sight. It was as if she had never been there at all. The labyrinth of shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, and the only sound now was the faint rustling of pages he swore he hadn't heard before. He pulled the book from its place, the leather groaning as it slipped free. There was no turning back now. His curiosity, that insatiable thirst for answers, had already sealed his fate. The title of the book finally became legible in the dim light, The Silent Hours. Ellis flipped it open, the pages smelling faintly of old parchment and something else, something darker, something forgotten. As he turned the first page, the words seemed to blur and shift before his eyes, as if the book itself were alive, watching him. "Read the first word aloud," a voice whispered, though no one was there. Startled, Ellis looked around, his breath catching in his throat. There was no one. Just the endless shelves of books, darkened by the dim flicker of light. Yet, despite the silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was listening. His heart pounded in his chest as he muttered the first word of the book under his breath, barely a murmur at first. There. The air around him trembled, vibrating ever so slightly, like the faint hum of a distant thunderstorm. But no storm came. Only the silence deepened, heavy and suffocating. Ellis felt a twinge of unease, but curiosity compelled him to continue. The City of Shadows. He read aloud this time, louder, with more certainty. As the words left his lips, a sudden gust of wind blew through the library, rattling the shelves as though they, too, were alive and stirring. The lights flickered again, and then, something worse. The book began to change. Ellis's breath caught in his throat as the letters on the pages began to dissolve, as if the ink itself was being erased by some invisible hand. The words, once clear and crisp, faded into nothingness. He flipped the pages frantically, his fingers trembling with growing panic, but with each turn, the text became less and less recognizable, until the pages were blank, entirely white. The library, too, began to shift. The familiar shelves now seemed to close in on him, the aisles narrowing with every passing second. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices surrounding him, but they were not voices of the living. No, these were the voices of the lost, the ones who had come before him, perhaps even the ones who had vanished with the books. He could hear them now, clear as day, though their words were indecipherable, lost to time. A shiver ran down his spine as the room began to swirl, warping around him like a mirage. Ellis backed away, gripping the book tighter, his mind racing. What had he done? What was this place, really? The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with a life of their own. And then, with a sudden lurch, everything stopped. The lights flickered one last time, and the whispers ceased. A heavy silence fell. Ellis was alone, standing at the center of the library. The book in his hands was once again legible, but it had changed. The title was different now, The Book of Forgotten Names, and beneath it, in faded, barely visible ink, were words he didn't recognize. You are now part of the story. A chill swept through him, colder than before, and he suddenly realized he wasn't alone in the library after all. The walls, the shelves, the books, they were watching him. Waiting. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, as though something or someone was there. Something that wasn't quite human. Something that had been waiting for him. Ellis's mind raced as he heard a low, guttural whisper in his ear. It's too late now. Ellis's heart hammered in his chest, his breath quickening. He wanted to drop the book, to run, to escape whatever madness had overtaken the library. But something held him there, tethered to the cold, ancient walls, unable to move. The whispers, distant yet impossibly close, swirled around him, as though the very air itself was alive, mocking him. It's too late now. The words echoed in his mind, and for a moment, the library seemed to stretch on forever, endless in all directions. The shelves tilted and warped, twisting into impossible shapes. It was as if the room itself was folding in on him, pulling him into a place where logic no longer applied, where time and space had lost their meaning. Ellis squeezed his eyes shut, trying to steady himself, to break free of the overwhelming sensation of being trapped. He opened his eyes again, hoping to find some semblance of reality, but when he looked around, everything was different. The walls had vanished. The shelves had disappeared, leaving only vast, empty space. The floor beneath his feet was no longer solid. It rippled like water, as though the library itself were dissolving, piece by piece, into nothingness. He could feel the temperature drop, his breath coming out in misty puffs, but the cold wasn't natural. It was an ancient chill, one that seemed to seep into his bones, as though the very air held the weight of centuries. And then, before him, the librarian appeared once more. Her presence was different now, more like an apparition than a person. Her silver hair floated around her head, as though it was suspended in the air, and her translucent eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. She was not standing, but hovering above the ground, her feet not quite touching the shifting surface beneath her. Ellis tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The words seemed to get lost somewhere between his mind and his mouth. "You've seen it now," the librarian said, her voice echoing as though it were coming from all around him. "The truth of the library. The books are not mere pages and ink. They are memories, forgotten and lost, pieces of time that no one was meant to uncover." She floated closer, and Ellis instinctively took a step back, but the ground beneath him rippled like water, pulling him toward her. His feet were no longer in control of his movements. "The books," she continued, her voice soft but laden with an almost sorrowful weight, "are not kept here for protection. They are imprisoned. And those who open them, who disturb the silence, become part of their story. The library, it remembers." Ellis could feel the words vibrating through his chest, as though the library itself was alive, resonating with the truth of what she said. The knowledge was suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. The room pulsed with the energy of 1,000 forgotten tales, each one echoing in the back of his mind. He tried again to speak, to ask her what he had to do to escape, but no words came. His body felt heavy, as though the weight of the stories was dragging him down, deeper into the library's abyss. The librarian's eyes seemed to soften. "You don't understand yet, do you, Ellis? This library doesn't just keep books. It takes them, and those who read them never leave." Her smile, if it could be called that, was not one of warmth, but of knowing, a secret shared by few, a curse borne by many. "You wanted to know about the vanishing books," she said, her voice now a mere whisper. "But what you've uncovered is far worse. You have become part of the story. A name forgotten, a life erased. You will fade, piece by piece, until there is nothing left but a shadow, a memory of someone who was." Ellis's knees buckled as the weight of her words settled over him like a shroud. His mind spun, dizzy with the overwhelming reality of his situation. He had come here seeking answers, but now he realized the terrible truth: there was no escape. The books weren't the only thing that vanished. So did the people who dared to open them. "You should never have come," the librarian said, her voice fading as though she were already slipping away, disappearing into the void. Ellis reached out, desperate to stop her, to ask one last question, but his hand passed through her like smoke, as if she were made of nothing more than an echo. The ground beneath him buckled again, and Ellis screamed, but the sound was lost in the silence that followed. The library, its walls, its shelves, everything that had once been familiar, was vanishing. The very air seemed to be erasing itself, taking everything with it. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, Ellis was alone in the dark once more. The book still lay in his hands, but its pages were blank now, the words that had once been there erased by the darkness. There was no title, no markings, nothing left but the weight of the book itself. "You have entered the story." The words appeared on the first page, written in a hand not his own. Ellis closed his eyes, and as he did, the library disappeared. The world, or what remained of it, was utterly still. The very air around Ellis seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No sounds. No shifting of shadows. No whispers. The once mighty library had dissolved into nothingness, leaving Ellis alone in the dark. He had no sense of where he was, only that he was no longer in the library. He could still feel the weight of the book in his hands, its pages eerily silent. Even without the flickering lights or the distant whispers, something inside him told him that he wasn't truly alone. Something was watching. "You have entered the story." The words were etched into his mind, a taunting reminder of the inevitable fate he now faced. He had been drawn into something far beyond his understanding, a world that blurred the line between reality and fiction. The library had not merely kept books, it had kept people, lives, memories. Those who ventured too close, who read its forbidden pages, were pulled into its labyrinth, never to be seen again. And now Ellis was one of them. He glanced at the book once more, its cover cracked and worn, the letters no longer legible. In the dim light, or what he assumed was light, for he couldn't discern the source, Ellis could barely make out the faint, faded title beneath his fingertips, The Library's Last Breath. The book flickered, as though it too were alive, its pages turning of their own accord. Ellis froze, every muscle in his body tensing as he watched, transfixed, unable to look away. The words on the pages began to rewrite themselves, shifting like smoke, forming sentences he didn't recognize, forming stories that weren't his own. He tried to read them, but each time his eyes focused on the words, they morphed into something else, something that made no sense, something that defied all logic. You will be forgotten. The words were clear now, etched across the page in bold, unforgiving ink. Ellis's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. He had to escape. There had to be a way out. But how? The ground beneath him shuddered, and for a moment, Ellis thought the world might crumble entirely. The space around him began to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. The air itself seemed to bend and twist, the dark, oppressive silence warping into something tangible, a physical presence pressing against him from all sides. Then, he felt it. A pull. A tug at the very fabric of his being, as though the world itself were trying to tear him apart. His body resisted, but the pull grew stronger, more insistent, until it was all he could feel. The book in his hands seemed to vibrate, its pages flickering faster now, faster than he could follow. The words blurred, and he could see them, see the stories, stretching back through time like threads weaving themselves into a tapestry that never stopped. He was part of it now, part of the endless story that had no beginning and no end. Suddenly, Ellis was falling. Not through space, but through time. The ground beneath him vanished, and he tumbled into a void, into a place that had no shape, no boundaries. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't even feel. It was as though he had become part of the air itself, an invisible wisp in the dark. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. He landed, though the ground beneath him was unfamiliar, soft, shifting, like sand, but it wasn't sand. It was something darker, something heavier. Ellis pushed himself up, his hands trembling as they made contact with the strange surface beneath him. His eyes strained in the dim light, trying to make sense of where he had ended up. He was no longer in the library. He was in a vast, open space. There were no walls, no shelves, only a swirling mist that hung in the air like smoke, thick and impenetrable. The air felt heavier here, as if it was filled with the weight of unspoken words, forgotten lives, and lost souls. The mist seemed to swirl around him, moving with purpose, and Ellis could feel it, hear it, though he couldn't explain how. The voices, distant, muffled, whispered in the air, overlapping one another in a tangled mess of broken conversations. There was something urgent about them, something frantic, as if they were all trying to reach him, to warn him. But from the thick fog, something emerged. A shape. A shadow. Not human, not quite, but close. It was a figure wrapped in darkness, its form shifting with the fog, blending into the swirling mist. As it moved closer, Ellis could make out its features, or what he thought were its features. Eyes, deep and endless, staring back at him, hollow and unblinking. You are part of it now. The words echoed in his mind, a declaration, a certainty. The figure's voice, if it could even be called a voice, was the sound of 1,000 whispers all speaking at once. The words were indistinct, lost in the chaos of the air around him, but their meaning was clear. Ellis was trapped. Trapped in the story, in the space between pages. A part of the library's twisted narrative, a thread woven into the fabric of something far greater than he could comprehend. And as the figure took a step closer, Ellis knew, he was no longer Ellis Gray. He was someone else. Something else. A name that would be lost in time. A memory that would fade, like all the others before him. He would vanish. And the library would remember. The figure loomed before Ellis, its presence suffocating, an immovable force in the midst of the swirling mist. Its eyes, endless and empty, burned with an unsettling intensity, their gaze fixed on him as if it knew everything about his past, his future, and the very essence of his being. Every inch of Ellis's body screamed to run, to escape, but his limbs were frozen, as though the fog itself had seeped into his very bones, chaining him in place. The shadow spoke again, its voice low and unearthly, its words sinking into Ellis's mind like thorns. You are part of the library now, Ellis Gray. You were never meant to leave. Ellis's heart raced. The name, his name, sounded strange coming from the shadow's lips, distorted and unfamiliar. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask, to beg for an explanation, but no words came. His throat was tight, suffocated by the heavy silence that pressed down on him. The figure tilted its head, a motion almost imperceptible, but it made Ellis feel as though he were being examined, studied under the weight of an ancient gaze. Time stretched thin between them, and he could feel it, an unbearable stillness, as though the very concept of motion had been stolen from the world. The figure reached out, its arm extending into the mist, and a cold wind swept through Ellis, chilling him to the core. As it moved closer, Ellis could see that the figure was not made of solid matter, but of darkness, a shape that seemed to shift with the fog, never truly forming into anything he could hold on to. It was as if it existed in the spaces between things, in the places where nothing was supposed to be. The books are memories, the shadow continued, its voice reverberating in the air, and you are one of them now. A forgotten story, a name lost in time. Ellis's mind reeled, trying to grasp the meaning of the words, but the more he listened, the more the world around him seemed to unravel. The mist thickened, swirling in greater patterns, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw faces, hundreds, thousands of them, blurred and indistinct, their features melting into the fog, their eyes empty, staring. "We are all forgotten here," the shadow whispered, its voice softening, almost mournful. "All the lost stories, all the voices that once spoke and then fell silent. You are not the first to arrive, Ellis Gray, and you will not be the last." The words were like daggers, cutting into him with their finality. He wasn't sure what frightened him more, the shadow before him or the realization that he was no longer a part of the world he once knew. He was no longer Ellis Gray, a man with a past, with a life. He had become something else. Something that didn't belong anywhere. The shadow moved again, its form bending and twisting in unnatural ways. It leaned closer, and Ellis could feel its presence pressing against him like a weight. The air around him became thick, suffocating, and it was as if the very space between them had begun to compress, drawing him in. "You will fade," the shadow said, its voice barely a whisper now, "but not before you leave a mark. A name. A story. Something for the library to remember." The library remembers all. Ellis felt his body grow colder still, his limbs heavy, as though something was draining the life from him. He reached out instinctively, as though grasping for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. Only the mist, thick and impenetrable, swirling around him like a storm. "Remember, Ellis Gray," the shadow murmured, fading as it spoke. "The library never forgets." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The world around Ellis began to shift again, the mist ebbing and flowing as if it had a life of its own. He was left standing alone, his heart still pounding in his chest, his mind swirling with the weight of what he had just learned. He had thought himself an observer, a seeker of truth, but now he realized, he had become part of something far greater, far darker than he could ever have imagined. He had stepped into the library's embrace, and now, there was no turning back. He looked down at the book still in his hands, its pages blank once more. The title, "The Library's Last Breath," had returned, though the words were fading again, shifting into new patterns, like the stories that were constantly rewritten, forgotten, and erased. The mist around him began to dissipate, but with it came an overwhelming sense of loss. Something inside him, his name, his identity, the very core of who he was, began to slip away, like sand through an open hand. He could feel the pull of the library, its hunger, its insatiable need to consume everything in its path. He was becoming a part of it. A memory. A forgotten story. A story that would vanish. And in the end, the library would remember. The silence that followed was deep, almost infinite, and yet it was the loudest thing Ellis had ever heard. Ellis stood in the quiet, watching the last traces of the mist disappear, like fading smoke slipping into nothingness. His hand still gripped the book, but it felt heavier now, as though it were absorbing something from him, his thoughts, his memories, his very essence. It was as if the library itself was drawing him further in, and he couldn't break free. He reached for his chest, trying to steady his breath, but it was like his heart was not his own anymore. It was beating out of time, out of place, as if each pulse came from a distant memory, a life that was not his. He no longer recognized the sound of his own breathing, the rhythm of it. It felt wrong. Suddenly, there was a flicker in the air, a shift in the space around him. It wasn't the mist this time, but something else, something that was growing, taking form just out of his line of sight. Ellis turned quickly, the weight of the book pulling him down, as though it wanted him to remain in place, tethered. A shadow appeared before him, familiar yet unrecognizable. It was a shape that had no clear edges, no defined form. The air around it hummed, vibrating with an unsettling energy. He felt it, the pressure building again, the familiar sense of something pulling at him, at his very being. "Do you remember your name?" a voice asked, but it wasn't the shadow's voice. It was a voice that echoed from every corner of the empty space, 1,000 voices blending together in one haunting whisper. Ellis froze, a chill creeping down his spine. He hadn't even realized he had forgotten it, the name that had once defined him. His thoughts scrambled to hold onto it, but the more he tried, the more distant it became. It was slipping away like water through his fingers, no longer something solid, something real. He grasped at the edges of his mind, his identity, but everything was becoming a blur. The book, the mist, the shadow, it was all merging, folding together into something that felt too large to comprehend. He could see fragments of his past, but they were all out of order, disconnected. Faces that weren't his, memories that didn't belong to him, lives he had never lived. And then it hit him. The library wasn't just a place of lost stories. It was a place where those stories became the people. The library was not just a keeper of books, it was a keeper of souls, a graveyard of forgotten lives. And now Ellis was no longer Ellis. He was becoming part of the book, part of the endless stories that drifted in and out of time, vanishing and reappearing, never truly remembered. His fingers trembled as he opened the book, hoping, no, praying, to find some answer, some way to hold on to his name, his identity. But the pages were blank again, save for one single, haunting line that appeared at the very bottom. "There is nothing left to remember." Ellis closed the book with shaking hands. His reflection in the cover was not his own. It was fading, like everything else, swallowed by the dark, swallowed by the library. And just like that, he was gone. Ellis's mind was fading. The pull of the library had grown so strong that it had become impossible to distinguish between thought and memory, between who he had been and what he had become. His very essence was slipping into the pages of the book, becoming part of the forgotten history. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something, some final truth, waiting to be uncovered. The air around him began to distort, the space bending as if it were warping to make room for something more. The mist had returned, thicker now, more suffocating. Ellis's breath came in short, desperate gasps as he struggled to hold onto the last remnants of himself. The book in his hands felt like it was burning him now, as though the ink on its pages was searing into his skin. "There is nothing left to remember." The words on the last page swirled, folding into themselves. But this time, as the ink shifted, a new message appeared. One that didn't belong. "Do you remember your name, Ellis Gray?" He blinked, his vision clouded, but the words were still there, forming before him. The question burned through his foggy thoughts, shattering the numbness that had consumed him. For a moment, it felt as if his very existence had been paused, as if the universe itself had taken a breath. He tried to speak, tried to recall his name, but his voice was silent, a mere echo. "Remember." And then it came, like a distant memory from another life, a life he thought he had lost forever. Ellis Gray. His name. His true name, the one he had almost forgotten. It came flooding back, not as an identity, but as a tether, pulling him back from the brink of oblivion. The ground beneath him shook. The walls of the library began to reform, their outlines faint and shifting. It was no longer the cold, ancient library he had wandered into. This was something different. The shelves, the books, the air itself were alive, swirling around him, pulling him in, as though they recognized him now. The whispers had stopped, replaced by something else. A figure emerged from the swirling chaos of the mist, tall and familiar, though Ellis could not quite place the face. The figure moved toward him, its footsteps echoing in the silence, and Ellis could feel something new in the air. A presence. Warmth. Something that felt like hope. "Who are you?" Ellis asked, his voice hoarse. The figure stopped, its face coming into focus. It was a woman, tall and regal, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Her expression was not one of sorrow or fear, but of recognition. She smiled. "I am the keeper," she said softly, her voice like a distant melody. "And you are the one who was never meant to forget." Ellis blinked. He hadn't realized until now that he was no longer alone. There was something else in the library. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The keeper stepped closer, and Ellis noticed something strange, a mark on her wrist, an intricate design that mirrored the symbols etched into the book he held. "I don't understand," he whispered, his thoughts a jumble. "What is this place? Why is everything vanishing?" The keeper's smile deepened, and for the first time, Ellis felt a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, or maybe a recognition of his own purpose. "This place is not what you think," she replied, her eyes filled with understanding. "It is not a prison. It is not a library. It is a place of stories, stories that are constantly rewritten. And you, Ellis Gray, are the author of them all." Ellis took a step back, his heart racing. "I don't understand. I'm not an author. The keeper raised a hand, silencing him. "You are not just part of the story, Ellis. You are the story. You've been writing it all along, every decision, every choice, every chapter. The library didn't take you. It brought you here, because you are the key to its existence." Ellis stared at her, disbelief twisting in his chest. "But I didn't. I never wrote any of this." She smiled again, this time with knowing eyes. "Ah, but you did. You wrote the stories you lived. You created this world. And now, it is time for the final chapter to be written." Suddenly, Ellis understood. The library, the mist, the books, the endless stories, wasn't just a place of forgotten lives. It was a creation. His creation. The choices he made, the stories he told, the paths he had walked, all of it had been leading to this moment. He wasn't just a lost soul in the library. He was the architect of it. And just like that, the books began to glow, their pages turning with a life of their own. The stories came alive, swirling around him, filling the air with the hum of creation. The mist began to dissipate, the walls of the library reforming into something new, something vibrant and filled with endless possibilities. Ellis held the book in his hands, now filled with words, his words. He realized, with a startling clarity, that he wasn't trapped in the library anymore. He was the one who had created it. And with that realization came the power to rewrite the story. He stepped forward, the weight of the book no longer heavy, but light as air. The keeper, watching him with a knowing smile, nodded. "The story is yours now, Ellis Gray. And the ending? It is yet to be written." The library, alive and breathing once more, faded into the distance as Ellis took his pen, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he wrote his own ending. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. If you're craving more mysteries, thrillers, and spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss out on the next chapter. The darkness is always waiting, and the next story could be just around the corner. See you in the next one, if you dare.